Hey everyone, welcome back to my review slash lessons learned from the Summit of Greatness. Today I want to talk to you about vulnerability and how precious vulnerability is, and how sometimes people can take advantage of our vulnerability, and how we have to give permission to people in order to be vulnerable. And this is really a lesson that I learned from Najwa Zadine Najwa Zebian, I'm sorry, from Canada. She is a Lebanese Canadian who is a school teacher right now, and that's what she does every day. But she's also a tremendous writer and poet. She's got two different books, Mind Platter and Nectar of Pain, both poetry books with some really fantastic messages in them. She also has done a TED Talk before, so if you want to look her up, um, you certainly can. She opens her TED Talk with a beautiful poem, and she also opened it up with two different poems at the Summit of Greatness. And so, what her message was, um, he was trying to find a home, and how she struggled for so long to find a home um, in Canada, in Lebanon, and really struggled with that much of her life, and really wasn't sure who she was and where her home was. And then she goes on and she finds a home in someone else. And unfortunately, that other person took advantage of her, and so she lost her home, and she lost a lot of things of who she was because she built her home in someone else. And when we look at all relationships, kind of tying to what we talked about yesterday with Esther in terms of building relationships, and there are two people in all different types of relationships, is that when you love someone and you start to love someone, you slowly build a home in that person. And her message was cautious in that you don't want to build your home entirely in someone else, because if they leave or they're no longer in your life, you have no home and you've lost yourself. So she talks about building a home in yourself, and being good enough and believing in yourself that when you do find someone, it's not about putting yourself in them. It's really about how can you supplement your house, how can you grow your house, but still not lose yourself. So it was a really cautionary story, um, and you can tell in the way she speaks that she's gone through some terrible things, but her strength and her ability to talk about them in an eloquent and uh, I won't say whimsical, but in such an enchanting or in entrancing way, right? Like I was caught from the moment she began speaking, and I felt like I knew her, although I had only listened to her for about 30 minutes. So yeah, but when we talk about that, she also in the question and answer talked about vulnerability. And one of the lessons, again, that I really want to share is that everyone talks about being vulnerable to one another and how we need to be vulnerable to one another to be our true selves. But a little bit of temperament in that vulnerability is probably wise. And that's the lesson that I want to share, is that being vulnerable doesn't mean you're vulnerable to everyone. It doesn't mean you're vulnerable to the guy or the girl on the street that you just met. It doesn't mean you're vulnerable to your best friend about all things. Um, to be vulnerable in any situation, you have to give permission to the other person to be vulnerable, for you to be vulnerable, right? Because you have the choice about how much you want to open up to them. And while I think it is important that you have those people in your life that you can be almost 100% vulnerable to, um, it is also important not to be vulnerable to everyone, and to really trust and understand the other person, because the minute you give someone your vulnerability, you can't take it back um, until you're hurt or they hurt you. And that was a powerful message that I received is Najwa um, opened herself up, made herself 100% vulnerable to this person, and this person betrayed her and continued to betray her. And what's worse, pretended that the vulnerability never happened, right? That it didn't even exist. And that was such a powerful moment in realizing the power of vulnerability and the power that each of us holds when we are vulnerable to someone, but also the understanding that when someone else is vulnerable to us, we have to hold and we have to respect that vulnerability. We can't be disrespectful when someone gives us permission for them to be vulnerable with us. So I want you to think about that for a second. When someone gives you permission, gives themselves permission to be vulnerable with you, you have to really take that seriously. And it may be a vulnerable moment. It may be a vulnerable friendship. It may be a vulnerable relationship. It may be the time of vulnerability can range from a few moments to a lifetime. But as achievers, as individuals who are looking to better themselves, who individuals who oftentimes people are vulnerable to, right? It's really, really important that you respect that vulnerability. I think that's something that we forget. And we may think about in the back of our minds, but that vulnerability is a privilege. And someone else's vulnerability is a privilege. So it's not something that we should take lightly, and we need to respect that moment. We need to respect that relationship and not hurt that vulnerability or hurt that person. And if you have been betrayed in any way when you've been vulnerable, her message of hope was, you do have control of your vulnerability. You are in control of your vulnerability. You choose who to be vulnerable to, and you choose who not to be vulnerable to. And we as the people giving out the vulnerability need to be aware of that. So I think that's where I'm going to stop right now for today. But if you did enjoy this, I know a little different than the last couple days, but I think still a powerful message. If you did enjoy this, check out Najwa's Facebook page, Instagram page, Twitter page. She posts a lot of her writings up there, and you really get a sense of who she is just through the written word. And if you get a chance to read about her fascinating story. If you have any questions or you like this, please feel free to shoot me a comment or share on social media, and we'll be back tomorrow to talk about a couple high energy talks that we had at Summit of Greatness that have really changed the way I do work now, even just 4 days after coming back from the event. Have a great day.